Before I start this video, I would like to recognize that I live, learn, and grow on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Katsi, Simiamu, and Kwantlen First Nations. Hello and welcome to my portfolio for Education 400. This is going to kind of be a look back, a reflection on my journey through this first semester of the PDP. It was definitely a roller coaster. Like I said in my portfolio presentation, I kind of feel like I went through all stages of grief. My mental state was kind of all over the place with everything. It was a very different kind of course than what, of course, we've been used to in maybe like SFU undergrad, and I think a lot of us felt very similarly to that. But luckily I had an incredible group of people to support me and be alongside me in this journey. So I think it would just be really fantastic to look back on everything that kind of transpired this semester and how I reacted to it and how I learned and grew from it, and what I can expect and what are my wishes for going into the next semester. To start off, I really wanted to look back at what I felt before starting the PDP, and I think one of the pillars of what I have as evidence for what my thoughts and feelings were towards becoming a teacher before starting the program was in my admissions essay. In my essay, I go into a lot of detail about how much I really admired educators in my life, and it was the only thing I really had to look back to for previous experience of, what could I expect when becoming a teacher. I talked so much about my love and admiration for my choir teacher that I had in high school. She was just a huge inspiration to me, and how so many other teachers acted as an inspiration and jumping point for me to want to get into education. And they didn't push me into it. They didn't try to sell me anything, but it was just their love and passion for it and for what they did that really inspired me to want to do something similar. And also the incredible impact that they had on me growing up. Just acting as incredible role models for me to look up to, just for being a good person, regardless of career. And that's really something that I wanted to bring into my education in the PDP and bring into what I want to be as a teacher. I want to be someone that people can look up to, and that takes a lot of really critical reflection, because students see everything. You're kind of bare when you're up there in front of a class. They, like I say before, like, kids can smell fear. So if you've got anything kind of lurking or hiding underneath, they're absolutely going to see that. And, it makes it just that much more difficult for you to maintain authority over a classroom and to create a really healthy environment. So a really fantastic classroom starts with you as an educator really understanding your strengths and your weaknesses. And I feel like that was definitely something that we were able to do during this semester. There was a lot of reflection, a lot of journaling, a lot of looking back at what our values are, and also really incredible group interactions, discussing, what we found in texts, discussing our previous experience. Something new that I was introduced to was just the breadth of experience that my peers had in this PLC. It was just incredible to hear everyone's different opinions and their different backgrounds, different cultures. Coming here from a different country impacts how they view education here in Canada, and some of the things that they didn't know about with Indigenous education and Indigenous history. And I think a lot of us also our eyes being open towards teaching students with disability. It was really incredible to have those group discussions and just get these myriad of different perspectives and things that you wouldn't think about, and creating a more holistic approach to teaching and to educating students of varying backgrounds. I definitely had a lot of anxieties before starting the program. I started to kind of put myself in the shoes of an educator and in the everyday minutia of being a teacher, and what it requires of you day in, day out. There's a lot of anxieties with that, because there is lesson planning, there's grading, there's all these kind of very real life practical things that I haven't had to interact with before. I've had incredible experiences with being, a teaching assistant, or now within this semester teaching one-on-one vocal lessons and getting to kind of interact with students. I've gotten a little bit more of that now. But it's a lot of anxiety of, you can't really try being a teacher until you are one. And I don't know how much I'll love it. You know, I know that I love the act of teaching, but I don't know how much I'll be able to withstand it being an actual career and having that practice of, you know, maintaining just a really steady, strong presence in the classroom. You know, like what happens when there are days when you are just like not with it? You know, there are days when you can barely get out of bed in the morning, and it's like, how do you get up and show up for those kids, even on those really difficult days, you know, no matter what you're dealing with in your personal life, you know, struggling to pay bills, struggling to take care of relatives, maybe, you know, you have a pet passing away. These are all things that I'm like facing in my personal life now, and it's really critical to reflect on, you know, how am I going to handle these kind of life events even when I have to show up and be the best teacher that I can be and not let it affect, you know, anything in the classroom. So that was something really interesting that I had to kind of grapple with this semester, and I think it was definitely one of my big anxieties. It's not that I am anxious that I won't love the act of teaching. I think it's more the steady rhythm and the kind of relentless pace that is required. It takes a lot out of you to show up every day like that. And I think that's something we really discussed a lot in class as well, was, you know, how to avoid burnout as a teacher, and, you know, what are things that you need to do in your personal life in order to take care of yourself so that you are able to show up. And it really just highlights the importance of TOCs and having really incredible resources so that you're able to ask for help. And you know, it's okay to not be okay. We're all still human, while still being an incredible educator and being guiding light for those students. Starting in the PDP, I was absolutely blessed with an incredible group of people in my book club, really diverse backgrounds, religiously, culturally. We had so many different perspectives to share on just, you know, one page and one chapter of our book club. There was just so much we could have discussed, you know, for hours, but we had to condense it and compile it down into kind of 500 words each week and just kind of make our main points, even though there was so much more complexity happening. I think a lot of our discussions really just ended up with the conclusion of like being an open and compassionate person, but really just coming into every situation with an open heart and an open mind and being compassionate and empathetic towards everyone. And it was just an incredible time. My PLC, our entire class, was just, I think we're all bonded now. I'm so excited to be able to call these people future colleagues. Really just made every class, you know, entertaining. And even if I was dreading having to get up and go and show up, they made it worth it. And, you know, I always left every class being happy that I came. So it was really just, you know, I'm really blessed and really quite happy with the incredible group of people, and it makes me even more excited for next semester. You know, I get 3 more semesters, or at least 2 more semesters of incredible classmates, and then, you know, whoever I get put with for our 13-week practicum. I'm super excited, and I'm so excited to meet all of these different students, especially next semester with our 6-week practicum, where it's a little less scary, a little less dire, a little less, please, I need to get this job, will you please behave in front of the people who are observing me, and a lot more just collaborative, getting to know each other, having those students, you know, have the privilege of being the first class I'll ever teach, and they get to give me all that feedback, and you know, giving them that responsibility of, you know, you guys get to shape a future teacher. So like, what do you guys want to see? What do you guys need? What is it like being in school right now? Because even for high school, you know, it's been 6 years since I graduated, which really isn't a lot of time. I kind of feel like my life is moving very quickly. It feels like just yesterday I was, you know, an undergrad sleeping in dorms and doing things that a 19-year-old does, and now I'm 24 and all of a sudden I'm being trusted with the responsibility of an entire class full of people. So that's another thing to add to the Sunday scaries list, which is very intimidating, but very exciting at the same time. It's really is a lot of balancing the anxiety and the excitement kind of all at once, and it kind of just gets bundled up together. Some other experiences while we were in the PDP, the Pro D-Day that we did was absolutely incredible. I went to the BC Music Educators Association kind of conference out in Richmond. It's a 3-day long conference. I was only able to attend on the Friday, but even then, just that one day was so incredible. It was so amazing to be in a huge room full of veteran educators that not only taught me, but I grew up really looking up to. These are such monoliths in the music community here in BC and, you know, from across Canada, and just incredible networking event. It was also really incredible to see friends of mine, you know, from my undergrad that I've known for years to be put in, you know, positions where they're organizing a lot of this stuff. And it's just incredible how quickly they're able to, you know, have these achievements. And it filled me with a lot of pride to see them up there being their incredible selves, because, you know, we know that our friends are so talented, but to see them so widely recognized, and also to be able to think like, hey, I'm on this path too. Like, there's going to be a day where I'm up there and there's a friend of mine in the audience that gets to see me do this. It's just really an incredible feeling, and it kind of put a spark back in me that I think I was missing. You know, end of October, you know, you're midway through the semester, and, you know, you can't say it just started, but there's not really a light at the end of the tunnel yet. The halfway point is always kind of the scariest, when you're going, oh, things are getting a little bit real now. I've got to actually start thinking about things like portfolios and you know, what am I going to say about this experience? But it was a really fantastic day, a beautiful moment of looking out on the crowd. They were singing, I believe it's called Paper Boats by John Rutter. If that is wrong, I will put the correct composer and piece on the screen here. But to see the BCMEA Honor Choir perform that was just incredible. And they handed out origami paper boats that each of the students had created, and they passed it out into the crowd. And it was just such a beautiful moment to see all these people in the audience connecting. They were friends, families, educators, just a group of people, a sea of hundreds of people just gather there to love and appreciate choral art. It was just incredible. Not just choral art, but, you know, music in general. And just to see people laughing and kind of, you know, breaking down the barriers of that kind of stiff audience mindset that you get at these more professional venues, to see people laughing and, you know, throwing them around and passing them around the audience, was a really incredible moment of community building. And that's a really big part of this program to recognize, is community building. I think that's one of the biggest things we talked about for creating a really healthy classroom environment. You know, what are things that you can do, you know, besides, you know, basic icebreakers? What can you do to break down barriers between students and get them talking and get them interacting and getting them working together, and really just appreciating what's happening around them, and to kind of have that lust for life again. I feel like so often in education, especially in secondary school, we kind of see students without their spark and without their light. So for me to be able to see what are different ways I can bring that back to students, and especially with choir, I think that is just one of the most essential things. I think everyone should sing in a choir in some capacity, just, you know, make music, make art with other people, because it really makes you feel a lot better about a lot of the things that are happening in the world. And it makes things less bleak. So I really, really enjoyed just seeing a group of teenagers be so incredible at what they do, and it gave me a lot of hope. It was really just a heartwarming moment. Now to the biggest part, I think, of the program. I think the part of the program that had the biggest impact on me, absolutely, was the observation week. Going around to those 4 different schools, I was nervous, I was scared, you know. I didn't know what to expect, because again, you know, it's been 6 years since I've been in high school, and a lot has changed in the world since that was there. There's been an entire global pandemic, there's been an AI takeover, there's been integration of technology in a way that we really haven't seen it before. And it's really scary because you see a lot of stuff online and everything needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But there is a lot on my feed about, literacy rates in students and, 7th graders can't do math at even at a 4th grade level, and all of these different things, back and forth. Your feeds are flooded with, behavioral problems. During this entire semester, we also had, the Alberta teachers strike, which was another kind of key element of what we were going through. Unfortunately, we couldn't dive too deep into it, and it's really difficult to get solid information, but it was still kind of on the periphery of what we were talking about, and it was definitely something we discussed in our book clubs of, what would this look like going forward? How is this going to affect BC teachers? Because I believe the BC teacher contract was also came up for renewal this year as well, and nothing's really been happening with that. There's been the BC GEU strikes. So a lot of union action, and that is a world that we are going to be stepping into when we get our teaching certificate. So that's definitely something that I hope to discuss a lot more in the future. Understanding what our rights are as educators, understanding, where does our job begin and end, because at the end of the day, we are teachers, we are not counselors, we are not parents, we are not therapists. Our job is to educate children and have them move on into the next grade, but we still want to do that in a holistic and community building way where we are, seeing our students as full individuals and seeing them that they are, just smaller people, they are still people, they are still human beings, and seeing them in a very three-dimensional way, while also, holding on to ourselves and our privacy. And it can get parasocial very easily, I think, in education. So understanding really where those barriers are, and where our jobs really start and end in that context. But for observation week, as soon as I stepped into the first school, all of those kind of scaries, all those anxieties absolutely went out the window, and it was just a nostalgia trip for me for the first day. It was so long since I'd interacted with anything in an elementary school, and it was so excited because, of course, I'm going into secondary education for social studies. So it was a totally new world that I haven't really interacted with a lot before, and it was, I have to say, so cute. Even the 7th graders, even, the scary, almost teenagers, adorable. I love them so much. The fact that I actually had the time of my life hanging out with a bunch of 11-year-olds, just because they were so entertaining, they were so themselves, they're so free of any kind of filter socially. They just came right up to me and were like, you're helping me, you're gonna help me with my math homework, you're gonna help me with my social studies project, because I was basically an EA for a day at Prince Charles Elementary, and I had so much fun helping these students. And there was a lot of really tricky moments that happened where I was kind of just thrust into this classroom, and how many years has it been since I've been in 6th grade? Over a decade at least. I'm 24 now, over a decade. And I had to teach them 6th grade math. Math is not my strong suit. After grade 9, that's when I stopped understanding anything. So I had to reach back in the memory bank and somehow come up with how to teach someone 6th grade math. I also wasn't there for the lesson that they were taught on this. So I don't know if there were different strategies and methods that the teacher taught for understanding this. So I'm having to pick things up from a worksheet with a couple of examples and teach them in a way that they will understand and, maintains what the teacher in their classroom had already been teaching. I managed to do it, and I had a lot of fun. The kids had a lot of fun. It was a really big moment of pride for me to say that, I was put into a situation where I didn't know what to expect. I didn't necessarily know what to do, but I was able to think on my feet and teach these students, and I was successful in it. They walked away knowing a little bit more, just a little, with a little bit more information than, when they approached me. So that was really, really exciting, and it totally brought my spark back for wanting to do this, because it was really just an incredible confirmation of okay, I am good at this. Like, this is something that I can do. There was a lot of anxiety around that, I think, throughout the entire semester, because we were having all of this time to reflect and be really critical of ourselves. And there's a lot of hypotheticals. Every group discussion involved a hypothetical. And you don't always know how you're going to react in those situations. So to be boots on the ground, to be face-to-face with these students, and to know that I have at least good instincts for how to teach them, even though it isn't the grade necessarily that I'm going into, just knowing that I have, decent instincts for how to teach someone else made me feel a lot better. I think it eased a lot of my anxieties. It made me incredibly happy. It made my heart very, very full to know that I helped a lot of these students. A lot of it was a little bit heartbreaking too, with seeing the very real life practical situations of students with disabilities, and where there is a lot of friction in terms of students actually getting the help that they need. I had one teacher kind of describe it to me as a triage situation, where the students who need it most are the ones who are getting it, and those who could benefit from it but are not necessarily required, those students kind of just get put to the wayside because there isn't enough resources. There aren't enough EAs, there just isn't enough time in a day, and not enough people around, and not enough space even. Like, a lot of these schools are like jam-packed. There is not a room to breathe in, except for, mandated ones. And it's really, really difficult. Luckily, a lot of the schools that I went into did manage to have kind of sensory rooms where students with maybe neurodivergence or other disabilities could go to kind of cool off, calm down, lots of warm lighting. Very few teachers used the overhead lighting in a lot of their classrooms, which was something I really liked that I noticed. And across all the schools, all the teachers that I saw, very few of them used the kind of overhead fluorescent LED lighting, which I personally despised when I was a student, because I could hear it hum, and it irked me, and it's so hospital blue lighting. I understand that it's necessary when you need to actually see something, but overall, in terms of environment, it's not very fun. So I think I will definitely be a teacher who has a lot of lamps and a lot of Christmas lights, and still, a brightly lit classroom, but hopefully with lots of natural light as opposed to LEDs and fluorescents and stuff like that. Just to, everyone benefits from it, not just students with disabilities or neurodivergence. Anyone neurotypical can benefit from just a slightly cozier, calmer environment. It's actually a great trick for babysitting too, that I realized. I did that a lot when I was babysitting, is I would turn down the lights and put on a Barbie movie and fill them with whatever macaroni and cheese or pizza was supplied by the parent, and those kids will be out in 45 minutes tops. So, using tools from all of the different tool bags that I have created over my life of, babysitting, customer service, office administration, being in education as a student, using all of those tools kind of all at once is something you definitely have to be good at doing when you are a teacher. Understanding every resource that you have available to you, kind of within you, or resources, outside of you that you can seek out for students, is definitely something you have to be very good at that I'm learning. I think the biggest takeaway from my observation week, though, is having to balance my really enthusiastic, outgoing side with a more calmer, reserved attitude. I really noticed that teachers who stayed very calm and spoke very softly, and they were projecting their voice, but not over projecting their voice. They did it in such a way where students really actually had to lean in and listen in order to understand what was being said. And I noticed that those teachers were able to keep the attention of their students a lot better, as opposed to teachers who kind of over projected and, spread themselves even a little bit too thin. And it kind of looked like they were reaching for each student rather than having each student kind of come to them with their energy. And I think that would really help with a lot of, burnout, and also my voice, even just talking for this long, it's, it's straining on the voice. I sing, I'm very in tune with what needs to happen in here. So kind of reducing the amount of energy that you're putting into projecting and overdoing something can really, really help students kind of lean in and come to you as well. Because after all, you're there to teach, but they're also there to listen to you. And I think it teaches a lot of really good discipline and understanding that, you know, it's meeting halfway. I'm not going to bend over backwards to help you. You get to come to me as well, and you get to seek out that help, because if you don't, you know, you're not going to pass. Of course, I get to speak from this as, you know, coming from someone who's going to be teaching secondary school, where I think a lot of what I'm going to be teaching is taking on responsibility and understanding consequences for their own actions of, yeah, if you don't show up and you don't complete this assignment and you do poorly on a test, your grade is going to reflect that. And teaching them cause and effect and consequence. Of course, that's something that's a little bit more difficult to teach in elementary school, because they're very formative years, and you're having to interact a lot more with parents and different teaching styles. That's definitely a lot more to juggle with elementary school. But at least for high school, that is something that I want to work on of, you know, I will be the best teacher I can be for you, but you have to meet me halfway as well. I'm not going to bend over backwards. But there is that side of me that is just so enthusiastic and so excited to be able to teach students history, because history is awesome. History is so cool. History is also happening all around us all the time, and you are directly involved with it, kind of whether you like it or not. It's a really fantastic thing that I get to, you know, show students that history is not boring. Even when I was in high school, I had social studies teachers that were just a drag. It was so boring. It was memorizing lists and dates, no matter how hard they tried for it not to be. That's what it boiled down to at the end of the day. It was going through textbooks and just highlighting and regurgitating information and kind of forgetting it the day after the test or the day after the essay, you know, only picking the parts that I actually needed for the assignment and chucking out the rest. And there's really big, you know, gaps in my education until I got to university and was able to kind of fill those back in myself. But I get to show students that it doesn't have to be like that, because when I look at history, I see storytelling. Everything is storytelling. Humans have been telling stories since the dawn of time, since we were able to think and function. And it's just incredible that I get to pass that down. And if they are interested in something, if they give me that one little lead, I can give them just like encyclopedias of knowledge and give them resources to go further, you know, what it is that they want to research. And I'm really wanting to be teaching them critical thinking, you know, cause and effect, responsibility, how to, you know, yes, looking at the French Revolution, even I get bored looking at the French Revolution, but how does looking at the French Revolution make you a better citizen today? And how does that make you a better, like, critical thinker? You know, what does that do? Like, sure, knowing about the French Revolution isn't going to help you get a job, but it will kind of help you vote and be a good citizen and understand, you know, where do things like propaganda come in? Where do all these things kind of evolve from? Knowing their formative paths. That's really something that I want to teach my students, and that's why I'm so excited to be able to get into that. And a lot of the social studies teachers that I went and looked at in Fraser Heights at the secondary school, they had these closets or bins full of costumes. There was one classroom that I went to that was just incredibly decorated with vines everywhere and flowers, and it was a portable, and yet it looked so cozy. Beautiful flowers everywhere and different wigs displayed as part of the decor, and also a closet full of costumes. And that was true for a couple of the other social studies teachers as well, which is fantastic because I'm a musical theater kid. Like, I did 13 years of it. I've done choral arts for 10, 12 years now. If there's anything that I love more than anything else, it's storytelling. That is the thing that I love doing, whether it's musically or written or sung, like anything. I love telling stories. So it was always kind of something that I wanted to do was, you know, pop on a wig, pop on a cape, and I'm going to pretend to be this person. Now let's have an interaction and let's try and do it. Just anything you can do to make it more interactive, more ridiculous, let it stick in their head, let it be entertaining. And I'll kind of get into a little bit more of that when we talk about the different texts that were read for this for this program, because that's definitely something that I want to elaborate on. But I think those are two things that I really want to work on in my practicum next semester, balancing my kind of enthusiastic musical theater, storytelling, really big passionate side of me with a more calm and reserved attitude. I'm not your best friend. I am going to grade your work fairly. I do want to see you try and put an effort. I'm not going to be giving handouts or, I'm not your best friend. I'm not going to do a favor for you. I'm going to grade fairly. Everyone is graded evenly. And, I still need to be stern and authoritative and maintain kind of discipline in the classroom. But if you work on that and you do all of that and, we have good, honest work ethic, you get this a really amazing, energetic teacher who's going to be so excited to show up every day. So learning how to balance that and also not burn myself out at the same time. That is something that I'm definitely gonna have to work on for next semester. For the next part of my reflection, I think I really wanted to look deeper in at the coursework that we did and the texts that we used within the class, but also some of the outside reading that I did to kind of further my reflections and further inform a lot of the discussions that we were having, if there are things that I could pull from other places. So I really wanted to kind of do my own research as well, and a lot of that research took place within Joanne Archibald's Indigenous story work, which is educating the heart, mind, body, and spirit. So I really, really enjoyed reading this throughout the semester. I didn't get to read the whole thing, but I was able to read kind of sections that further informed things, and it's all about story work and the pedagogy behind it and why it's important. And it really, really ties into a lot of my philosophies when it comes to teaching, and especially being a social studies teacher in Canada. I think it's incredibly important to have something like this to kind of reference and look back to and learn from. But I actually wanted to start off with highlighting a section from Indigenous rights that we read this semester. We did so much Indigenous education this semester, and it's so multifaceted, and there's not really one thing that I could pick from to look at really closely in that text, because it was so broad and the discussions were able to be so wide that it's really difficult to kind of narrow it down, what's one thing that really changed your perspective on it, because it was just so broad and so informative. And a really, really great tool. And I really loved the language in this textbook as well. I think it's definitely how I want to approach teaching. I think a lot of academia can be very inaccessible for a lot of people. I know I had a really, kind of arduous process of understanding the kind of academic language. And, there are a lot of kind of barriers to entry. There's a lot of paywalls involved in academia. So being able to have resources that, talk to you like you're another person, like you're having a conversation. I really, really enjoyed the kind of conversational language of both of these books, and as well as kind of the short stories that we were able to read in Disability Visibility. I really loved kind of the personal perspective and just like the power of storytelling, how it's showing and not telling a lot of the time, and a lot of things that you don't necessarily think about when you're looking at people with disabilities. It's not about looking past or ignoring a disability to see the person within. It's about seeing the entire person along with their disability and how their disability interacts with who they are, because it does shape and inform a lot of who they are. It's a part of them. And, just as you would, find a chair for someone who with an injured leg or someone who is pregnant, you're going to find other accommodations for people with disabilities in that same way, and it doesn't make them less than, it doesn't make them an other. So it was really, really great for reframing how we interact with students with disabilities, and how a lot of the examples from this book, discussing that with our book club, and how would we deal with, or how would we interact with a student with certain disabilities that we encountered in this book. So that was really, really fantastic. But I wanted to highlight one specific section from Indigenous rights, just because I really felt like it kind of affirmed and aligned with these kind of philosophies that I've been coming up with for quite a while. My entire undergrad at SFU, as I was learning about history, I really, really enjoyed tying in Indigenous education to it. And I'd always felt really called to this kind of Indigenous story work. And when you pick up and you're reading something by an Indigenous academic, it is really the language in it is quite personal and it's quite conversational, and something that I really love that they do, and something that Chelsea Vowell really did in this book that I loved was in the intro she introduced herself and where she was coming from and who she is and why her perspectives are the way that they are, and it continued to inform the entire rest of the text as well. And it's something that I really love about Indigenous authors and Indigenous academics, is because they always include that part of themselves and you understand where their perspectives are coming from. And that is really a lesson that I want to teach to my students, that, you know, everything that you read, every research paper, every journal, every article, every post that you see on the internet, every person that you interact with is coming from their own background and their own perspectives. And that really largely informs what they write and the work that they do. You know, it pops up everywhere. I have a ton of examples from my undergrad of, you know, I was reading certain research papers for a research paper that I was writing, and understanding where that author was coming from it really helped to inform, you know, what are my takeaways here. You know, there was one where the person I was reading ended up being a Greek nationalist, which is, you know, inconsequential to what we're talking about here, but it was really important because it informed, you know, the opinions that they had on the research that they were doing and how that might affect my research as using them as an academic source. So really understanding who wrote, you know, what you are reading and the work that you are using was really quite important to research, and that's definitely something I want to bring into social studies education. The section of Indigenous rights that I really wanted to highlight was in chapter 13, pages 119 to 121. It was the Myth of Progress chapter. There's a section here on media portrayals of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and it really highlights the perspectives that a lot of people bring into, you know, learning Indigenous histories. And it's like, oh, it's something in the past, it's something kind of far away. And it also points out that you're combating a lot of prejudice when you're teaching this kind of stuff in a classroom. And it's not necessarily the fault of the student. You know, the student doesn't come in maliciously to a lot of these things. And I think that is something really important to keep in mind when you're teaching history, is that a lot of people are going to have, you know, preformed opinions based off of kind of scraps of information that they've been given throughout their life, whether that's kind of misinformation on media, prejudices that their parents held due to experiences that they had. You're combating a lot in a classroom. I know growing up, there was a lot of prejudice and discrimination towards Indigenous students, and I was brought up with the notion that, you know, they go to university for free and they don't pay taxes because they're on reserve, and all of these absolute myths that so far from the truth. And honestly, a lot of it can kind of be linked back to like propaganda from the Canadian government and just these really long-held discriminatory prejudice, you know, beliefs. And it wasn't my fault necessarily that I had that, because that was just the opinion of the people around me when I was growing up. And I had to put in the work to unlearn that. And I'm still trying with my family to kind of educate them further, you know, in places where I can. Obviously wanting to be a good activist, a good ally to the Indigenous peoples of Canada and Indigenous peoples everywhere. Us in North America have this really particular perspective on living on land that is not ours, where with, you know, European history and culture, that land for the most part was theirs, but there are still a lot of exceptions to that rule, and seeing where that differs. And, you know, even going to England, going to the UK with my choir, teaching, you know, choirs in England about, you know, Indigenous education and how that plays a really huge role in what we do as a choir, and the composers that we commission and the pieces that we choose to perform. It's a really incredible thing to be able to teach someone about that, but it's always important to have the understanding that people are going to come into those conversations with very, very different perspectives and very, very different things that they have learned in the past, and how to kind of deconstruct those things. So I think a really big theme for this semester when it came to interacting with the coursework was learning versus unlearning. That was really a huge pillar. I wanted to integrate some kind of like textile work into this, because the place where I really interact with learning and unlearning, I think the most in a physical form, is like crocheting or cross stitching, any kind of textile arts where, you know, you're gonna crochet one line and then you're gonna realize you did it all wrong. And a large part of crocheting is like undoing your work, at least while you're getting good at it, before it becomes like muscle memory. It's something that a hobby that I've been wanting to pick up for so long. But yeah, a large part of me trying to learn how to crochet or learn how to cross stitch is undoing my own work, which really felt like what was happening in this semester. It felt like clearing out cobwebs. It felt like really just making sure that my foundation and understanding of Indigenous peoples in Canada was solid and, you know, was as truthful as we could get it to be, because there are always going to be things that I don't know. There are always going to be misunderstandings, you know, there's always going to be false information floating around. But I think the biggest lesson to learn is to listen. You know, I will not always be the most educated person on that subject, and I don't pretend ever to be. And you step aside and you give room for people with those voices to speak up and give them room to explain and educate. And I really think that's fantastic. And, you know, if there is ever an opportunity for me to invite an Indigenous elder or an Indigenous knowledge keeper or an Indigenous storyteller into my coursework, that would be something that I would be so excited to do. Something hands-on with my students. We can go in and create something and do something where they could take something home, and kind of understand the marker, act as like a physical marker in their education. I think would be a really fantastic project for them to do. But yeah, I really enjoyed this section, and I have, you know, notes written on the page here of like learning to combat predisposed prejudices in the classroom, and really just the notion that history is all around us. Just because something happened in the past doesn't mean that story is necessarily over or those effects have ended, because they haven't. There continues to be people affected by things imposed by the Canadian government. You know, even though we might have reversed things or changed things 50 years ago, there are still people affected by certain policies. So really just getting students to understand that history is something that's happening all around them, and they are still very much connected to the story of what is happening and the story of human history, is really, really important. So it was incredible to see a very similar philosophy of mine that I had, you know, in the past, kind of put into an Indigenous lens, and it just opened up a bunch of new pathways for me to include Indigenous education in the classroom, and I was very, very excited to see something like that in the textbook. The section of Joanne Archibald's book that I really wanted to include in this presentation was chapter 6 on storytelling or story work pedagogy. It really just details kind of their process of creating a curriculum around Indigenous story work, and what that was like to kind of, and what it was like to put that into practice, and, you know, what would this look like in a classroom, and what was the feedback they were getting from students and educators, you know, what stories do you choose to tell? And it was really interesting, actually, that one of the key points that they encountered with the success of story work pedagogy being kind of integrated was the enthusiasm from the person telling the story, which I thought was great, and it aligned perfectly. And I'm like, well, I have enthusiasm in spades, so hopefully that will translate well to my teaching. I actually also made a really interesting connection while reading this section, and while reading a few of the kind of example stories that they choose to include. A lot of them read, and a lot of them have similar language to things like Aesop's fables or stories from the Bible, anything that you could use as kind of a story with a larger metaphor and a larger lesson to learn from. It's exactly like Tortoise and the Hare, any of these kind of like stories of hubris in ancient Greece, you know, all of that is kind of so tied up in Indigenous story work as well, which is crazy because it came from two vastly different cultures. And it really goes to show how the root and foundation of so many of our cultures, whether it's Indigenous or Western, are rooted in storytelling and sitting by, you know, a fire, or sitting by a meal, or being entertained by an elder in the community, of them telling these stories and having lessons integrated within them. And those stories are not just for children. You know, you can have something as short as Tortoise and the Hare, and something as long as epic as, you know, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And I'm sure that that breadth is also included in Indigenous story work. I'm sure there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of stories told by Indigenous communities that could be used in place of, you know, Greek fables and epics, and any other cultures. The Greek is just, you know, the humanities is just what I have the most experience with, which is why my mind went kind of right there. It was really just fantastic to see the kind of crossovers between that, and where I can kind of intermingle and exchange those things if that's something that I wanted to teach. If I was, you know, substituting for an English class, or if I was chose to teach an English class, and even in social studies, I think we focus a lot on the history aspect of social studies and not necessarily so much on the humanities side of social studies. The way that I like to describe it to people is history is what happened and humanities is how we reacted to it. So kind of the artwork and the literature that grew from certain events happening. And you can't really have one without the other because they kind of coexist so beautifully, because, you know, certain art and literature inspires certain events to happen, which then inspires new artworks and literature and everything. So it's just this like Ouroboros of knowledge, and it's so fantastic to kind of hold those things together. And I think indigeneity and Indigenous education just does that so seamlessly. And, you know, we have a lot to learn from them. Anyone who grew up in a Western culture absolutely has so much to learn from Indigenous ways of life, you know, interacting with the world around you. Exploration A was a fantastic way for me to just get outside, take a breath of fresh air. It was actually really nice to have it on Mondays because my choir rehearses on Monday nights, and that's out in Kerrisdale. So usually in the spring, I love sitting under the cherry blossoms, and, you know, I'll pick up sushi for dinner and sit under the cherry blossoms and, you know, rehearse and go over my notes before choir starts, which is really fantastic. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend sitting under some cherry blossoms in the spring. It's just fantastic. But doing that this semester as well with things that are around me. You know, I live here on a farm, on a blueberry farm out in South Surrey. So it was really beautiful watching. We have all these heron and, you know, little birds that flutter around, and I would sit by the window and watch the birds with my cat sometimes when I couldn't make it outside. Or we did even longer kind of field trips. Me and my partner, we went up to Tyne Head, we went for walks, even out at Redwood Park. Just beautiful, beautiful areas, sitting under like the giant sequoia trees, which aren't native to Canada, but they're beautiful and big, and you could just sit under them all day. And it was a really great time to reflect and to journal a little bit and just reconnect with the world around you. So I really, really enjoyed being able to kind of do that and integrate all of those things together. One of my fellow students in the portfolio presentation referred to their teaching as activism, and I really, really loved that notion because, you know, I'm not going into this with any kind of political affiliation, of course. Like, that is just something that it should be talked about in social studies, but it's not for me to ever impose or direct them in any kind of opinion, but it allows me to give them the tools that they would need in order to be their own activists. I'm a huge believer in self-advocacy, so anything critical thinking, being able to look at the world around you and events that have happened and think, like, what led to this? Because that kind of critical thinking helps you even in your job. I've had a boss kind of pull the table out from underneath me, and you need to be able to think on your feet and think critically and be able to form opinions and craft well-worded emails and be an advocate for yourself. And that really, really starts when you're young, being able to say, you know, I am important, I deserve to take up space, every person deserves to take up space, and I want to advocate for myself. And that is exactly the kind of attitude that I think this new generation really, really needs, because it's one that lessons I've had to learn the hard way. And if I can do anything to kind of, without my students really knowing, give them those tools to advocate for themselves and for others, for minority groups, and stand up for anything that they believe in. Because even if passion may be misdirected in some ways, at least there is passion. The worst thing I could ever see is like an unmotivated child or someone who doesn't have that kind of spark and that roaring fire within them. That is something that scares me a lot, and something that I'm worried about with, you know, the rise of AI, the rise of social media. It sucks the life out of you. And I really just hope to be able to invigorate my students and keep them from going into that dark, scary place that is all too familiar to anyone who is chronically online. You know, that is my wish, is to kind of help these students see the light a little bit and see that there is so much more to life than what happens through a screen, that the best people you will ever know are right next to you all of the time. And all it takes is opening up your heart and opening up your mind and talking and interacting and telling stories. You know, history is a fantastic story to tell, but everyone has their own. I could sit here for hours and tell you different stories from my life and what I've learned from them and how you could learn from them too. And that's a fantastic part of being a teacher, is that I kind of get to do that, at least in some capacity. But I want to teach my students how to do that as well. You know, how do you speak up about yourself? How do you tell your own story? Because that's also very important for, you know, admissions essays, for job hunting, how you kind of sell yourself. And yeah, I just really hope to teach my students that passion. And if I can't teach it to them, I at least hope that a little bit of mine rubs off on them. And I hope to just be like the most contagious, wonderful teacher on the planet. But those are very, very high hopes, and I definitely have a lot to learn. Moving forward into next semester, I think there are a lot more practical things that I need to learn, which will definitely happen in the 6-week practicum. Obviously, it's for that kind of hands-on experience, but it would be nice to receive a little bit more education on maybe different education methods, or like the history of education. You know, what is the Montessori method when it comes to teaching? What are, you know, different tools that we can use, or different methods, just to add to our toolbox and to have a greater variety of things, because I know there are a lot of holes in my knowledge of when it comes to teaching, and a lot of that comes from just putting in the work and becoming a veteran in the field and just like learning on your feet kind of wherever you can. But it would be nice to also get maybe a little more hands-on coursework with that. You know, a few more kind of rules and regulations. You know, how do you handle a fire drill or something? Or even, you know, what does it mean to be a mandatory reporter for certain things, and how does that interact? Because there are just a lot of like questions and kind of answers I still definitely need, and I think I'm really just looking for more of that hands-on practical tools that I can use kind of in my one-on-one lessons that I'm, you know, starting to do now. It's been really great. I've been learning a lot on how to time manage and, you know, kind of read each student's kind of needs and what would work best for them. I'm definitely trying to come off as like, voice lessons are not scary. It's okay to sing. It's okay to not sound good. 90% of singing sounds like a cat in a dryer, and it's the 10% where you perform that is the part that is supposed to sound good. And even then, you're always improving, you're always growing, and your voice is a muscle, and all of these things, kind of framing it in a way where it becomes a lot less intimidating. And, you know, definitely wanting to do that with history, with Indigenous education, making things less intimidating, making things more accessible, and putting myself back in the shoes of someone who didn't have any of this, because it's really difficult when you grow and learn in your field and you're becoming kind of an expert or a professional in your field, going back to your roots and going back to a blank sheet can be very, very difficult to know, like, okay, where do I start? Because everything's kind of all intermingled together. So how do I go back to these kind of like elementary rudiments and begin from there and see where it goes? And my main kind of way that I've been handling that is just allowing the students' curiosity to inform where we go. If they ask me questions, and they say, oh, that sounds a little complicated, and I'm like, it's okay. I'm like, you don't have to understand all of it, but I'm just trying to answer your question in some ways and just teach them. They might only get that first little step, but that's really what I was trying to teach them. But, they asked why. They wanted to go further. And because it really is that interest and like their personal curiosity that will drive them further. So just helping curate that. It's not necessarily about being able to say I taught them X, Y, and Z. It's really about feeding that curiosity and letting them want to go further while also sneaking in a little bit of learning. That's kind of how I handle working out. I'll go to a dance class and I'll trick myself into working out because look, I moved, but I was really more interested in dancing, and I was more worried about, hitting all the right poses and doing all the right moves and beat than I was, oh my gosh, this is exhausting. I'm sweating. I'm so tired. You got to kind of distract yourself in that way. So a good old bait and switch, I think, is always good for for trying to teach 5-year-olds. But then again, I would really enjoy kind of more of that education from, veteran professional instructors. What are things that they have learned? What are curriculums that have been in place? What is the kind of black and white text that we need to understand as teachers to make sure that we are following, rules set in by the districts and by Government of Canada? What are things in our contract? Where does our job start and end? And what can we advocate for ourselves as teachers when it comes to doing a lot of work that we're not necessarily being paid for? Because teaching really does take over a lot of your life. You bring a lot of that work home, whether it comes to grading or, decorating their classroom. A lot of that's coming out of your own pocket. So there's a lot of these kinds of things to juggle and to handle when it comes to stepping into education. So I'm hoping to learn a lot of that from whatever teacher I get placed with in the 6-week practicum. But I also would really love to see a lot more of that coursework coming from the PDP, maybe something on like the history of education. I kind of perused the textbook we're going to be using for next semester, and I think a lot of those questions should be answered. So I'm very excited to sink my teeth into that. This semester has been all over the place, but I'm really happy with where things are going. I think overall, I have a really great foundation and understanding of what it means to be an empathetic, compassionate leader in the classroom, and what it means to kind of be in front of a group of students and to combine all of the different needs of those students all together. And so now that we're aware of it, I'm really excited to actually kind of put that in practice and put that in motion and, look at where do I need to improve and where can I use my strengths to the fullest of their ability to maybe kind of make up for things that I'm not so good at. And really just learn from them and let the students teach me everything that I need to know about being a teacher and what that requires of me. Overall, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for watching however long this video is. I have been talking for way too long. And I think I'm gonna go get to editing this and posting it and enjoying the holidays with my family and cuddling up with my cat and reading lots of books and preparing for next semester, kind of taking the downtime that I definitely need over the next kind of 3 or 4 weeks, and then getting ready for what should be a really, really exciting spring semester. So yeah, thank you again for watching. Thank you again for an incredible semester, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.